After months of waiting, the murder trial of Derek Chauvin is underway in Minneapolis. This is a live look inside the Hennepin County Courthouse. Both the prosecution and defense have presented their opening statements to the 12-person jury. The trial is expected to continue throughout the day and for weeks ahead. Chauvin was fired from the Minneapolis Police Department last May for the killing of George Floyd, a 46-year-old black man. He faces charges of second and third-degree murder and second-degree manslaughter. Floyd's death sparked global demonstrations in support of the Black Lives Matter movement and policing reforms. Many believe the trial could represent an important inflection point for racial justice in the United States. CBS News' Skylar Henry has more from Minneapolis.
Yes, our attorney should block your view.
Fired Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin surveyed the courtroom as the judge gave instructions to members of the jury. The 19-year veteran has pleaded not guilty to the murder and manslaughter charges in the death of George Floyd. Prosecutors began their opening statements.
Mr. Derek Chauvin betrayed this badge when he used excessive and unreasonable force upon the body of Mr. George Floyd.
Prosecutors wasted no time playing a video of Chauvin arresting Floyd, kneeling on his neck for almost 9 minutes.
He's not responsive right now.
Black Lives Matter! Black Lives Matter!
The video fueled one of the largest protest movements in U.S. history, with demonstrators demanding an end to police brutality and systemic racism. The defense is expected to argue the fentanyl found in Floyd's system, along with his underlying health conditions, contributed to his death.
As crowds begin to build up outside of the courtroom, there's also a significant security presence outside of the courthouse in and of itself, with fencing and concrete barriers, as officials are concerned about the possibility of unrest either after or during the trial.
Before proceedings began, members of Floyd's family, their attorneys, and supporters took a knee for the length of time Chauvin's knee was on Floyd's neck.
George Floyd was living, breathing, walking, and talking just fine until the police put him face down and put him in handcuffs and put a knee on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. So this murder case is not hard when you watch that torture video of George Floyd.
The trial will be live streamed with jurors positioned off camera to protect their identities. The panel of 14 includes 8 people who are white, 4 who are black, and 2 who identify as multiracial. That could be critical in a case with so much racial significance. Skylar Henry, CBS News, Minneapolis.
I want to turn now to Candace McCoy. She's a professor at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice at the City University of New York. Professor McCoy, welcome. What do you make of the opening statements from both sides?
Well, this was to be expected, pretty much covered what we thought it would, knowing what we have heard over the last year in the pretrial motions. The prosecution is relying right now on video, very powerful, hard video to watch. The prosecution's opening statements also set out to sort of preempt the defense attorneys, the officer Chauvin's defense attorneys' statements that George Floyd's drug use is what killed him. The prosecution emphasized that whatever the drug use, whatever was in Floyd's system, the cause of death was that Floyd was handcuffed behind him. He was agitated, and the response of Officer Chauvin was to ramp up the control to keep his knee on the neck, rather than what the prosecution said was, in your custody is in your care. In your custody is in your care. Floyd was in custody at that point, the prosecution said, so it didn't matter if he was agitated or if he had drugs in his system. The fact was that the police officer's response at that point should be to, in effect, de-escalate, which is a word that many people lately use. Also, the prosecution pointed out that the witness list, the witnesses to come, there are going to be a lot of them. What was surprising to me somewhat is the number of Minneapolis Police Department officials who will testify against this officer, including the police chief, the training officer, and the first witness, which we heard, was the 911 dispatch person who finished her testimony by saying she'd never seen anything like this. She called the sergeant over. She was very concerned. So this was what the prosecution started with. The defense opening statements, very heavy, again, as I mentioned, the drug use that Mr. Floyd had engaged in that day, but also the many different, quote, speedballs found in the car where he was, the fact that he engaged in a, quote, great struggle beforehand with the officers, all of which millions of your viewers, Nikki, have seen already as we've looked at these very difficult to view videos, including from the officers' body cameras. Mr. Floyd was not cooperating. He was agitated. He seemed to be very frightened. He would not sit in the police SUV to be taken to booking after he was handcuffed. And that's when this great struggle ensued. That's when they subdued him the way they did, and he died. Mr. Floyd's actions, quote, contextualize is what the defense called it. The videos need contextualized. So the defense attorney is saying that when you see the broad context of what went on, you'll understand more why Derek Chauvin had to do what he did. What was also unusual to me, and something that many people have wondered about as we've viewed these videos, is the bystanders. The defense seems to want to blame the bystanders for being loud, for trying to intervene, for demanding that the officers check the pulse, for screaming, he's dying, he's dying. And it was drawing a crowd. There was video of Officer Chung, I think, standing between the struggling body and Chauvin and Floyd and the crowd so as to keep the crowd away. The defense seems to indicate that the crowd itself was somewhat of a threat and that Chauvin was responding somehow to that. I don't know how that's going to play out. None of us know how it's going to play out, Nikki. Those were just the opening statements. Not anything surprising, and yet a few twists that may be important in the future days to come.
I think there's no doubt that millions of people were watching these opening statements, and we've all seen bits and pieces of the video in the past year, but it was really something to see all roughly 9 minutes at once. And I think a lot of people will make their own opinion on what they think, but the video, of course, speaks for itself in a trial like this. Professor McCoy, you have argued Derek Chauvin should plead guilty to the third-degree murder charge that was just added earlier this month. Why do you believe he should take that step?
Because he is. People usually plead guilty because they have done something, but not necessarily what the prosecution says they did in terms of all of the charges. So Chauvin is charged with 3 different things. He's charged, and the prosecution's opening statement pointed out that the 3 different charges go to what was his intent when he came into this situation. Did he show up at this call with the intent of murdering somebody? That is the highest charge. But the second highest charge is, was it an unintentional homicide? He got there and he got so angry at Floyd, he said to himself, I'm going to kill this guy. Or the third charge, even lower in level than the other two, is what is called the depraved heart. That Floyd was dying and Chauvin didn't care. That he just kept doing it, knowing that the man was dying. If you look at all the various video we've seen so far, and of course we haven't seen that the context that the defense is trying to put out and to show us about. But as things appear on the videos, at least, from not just the one the prosecution brought, but the ones from the body camera and the security camera at Cup Foods, it seems that, in fact, Chauvin didn't care that the man was dying.
It all comes down to...
And in that case, he would be guilty of this third-degree homicide. So if he pled guilty to that, his punishment would be lower. He's looking at a very high prison sentence if the jury were to convict him on the premeditation. But he's looking at approximately 10 years in prison, 2/3 of it to be served and a third on parole. In other words, 6.5 years in prison, which is pretty heavy, not to be sniffed at for the depraved heart, as opposed to 40 years otherwise. So he would plead guilty not only because that's what the evidence shows, but because he would get a lesser punishment. So I argued, in fact, Derek Chauvin should plead guilty, also to save himself and the people of Minneapolis the trauma and pain of reliving all this as we view this trial.
We will wait to see what 12 men and women civilians decide. Candace McCoy, thank you so much for your insight.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.